So I grew up in Brisbane and went to school at Christian Outreach College up there in Brisbane, and actually my best mate growing up was mad for the Air Force, so I actually went along to the recruiting centre with him to basically give him mutual support as he went through the process, and found myself with an application form in my hand and applying for a $1,000 scholarship to come to the Defence Force Academy, which I ended up getting, and thought I'd come and see how it went, and almost fell into the career compared to him, who was so heart set on it. And here I am today, 24 years later. Both my grandparents were in World War II. Both of them fought in Asia. One of them went through the sort of training camps in Egypt before ending up back in Asia in the jungles in New Guinea at sort of war's end. As his war was coming to an end. So yeah, there's a family connection to the military, but not in the immediate generations, and not to the Air Force. The postings are worked out sort of with three factors. There's the individual's preference. There's the kind of needs of the service, I suppose, and then there's a timing component to it as well. So in my situation, I was on a course that did fairly well. There are a bunch of us that had appropriate kind of grades to be capable of commencing fast jet course. Of that group of people, I was the least well graded of them, and so the others went on. There were insufficient spots for me to start there, and so as a result I went to my second preference, which was off to transport aircraft. And in that case, once again, I think similar to the Defence Academy, where we tend to mature our people to an age where they're more likely to succeed. That gave me an opportunity to develop my flying in different ways, and then to come back when I was probably better prepared to continue the course as well. My first squadron posting was number 34 Squadron at Fairburn, then an Air Force base here in Canberra, where I was flying the Falcon 900 VIP transport aircraft as a co-pilot. So the way that we crew those squadrons and those aircraft is we have a very experienced captain who's come from a transport background to be in command of those aircraft, particularly while we're flying around Her Majesty the Queen or the Governor General or whomever else, and often an inexperienced co-pilot who's coming straight from pilot's training to go through that process. So I was there as a co-pilot. When we had VIPs on board, I was raising and lowering landing gear and talking on the radio and backing up the captain, and then being developed when we'd often be moving the aircraft from one place to another without VIPs on board. Transitioning from my VIP transport background to fighters was definitely, there's a lot new about that. The aircraft and the style of flying was very new, but also the squadron environment was new. Now, to be frank, the VIP squadron is an atypical transport squadron as well, but it's very rare in those transport squadrons where you have aircraft all around the world at any given time, and people doing flying activities at all times across the clock and all days of the week. It's very rare to have all the members of the squadron in one place at one time, whereas in a fighter squadron, particularly when we're in peacetime training operations and exercises and things like that, we have a lot more opportunity to gather together as a squadron to start and finish at the same time together, and as a result, I found it to be a particularly close-knit group of human beings in all the jobs I had on fighter squadrons, from a brand new pilot seeking to kind of forge their way and prove themselves at the front line up in the Northern Territory, all the way through to my role as the commanding officer of a fighter squadron as well. My first operational deployment with Hornets was in 2003. To then Operation Iraqi Freedom, as the Americans called it, Operation Falconer, as we called it in Australia, for the operation to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein and to deal with what were then believed to be weapons of mass destruction at the time. So I was part of number 75 Squadron's deployment to the Middle East for that activity, and spent about 3 months over there while we had fighters in the region. I was a flight lieutenant, so an army captain equivalent. the bulk of the flying there was primarily support to land forces. Long range, strike ahead of friendly forces, but very rapidly it became reactive, close air support of friendly land forces as they moved through the country to ensure their safety as best we could based on the threats that they came upon. In the early days we were conducting defensive counter-air missions in support of the operation as well, with an expectation that we may have met an airborne adversary as that operation kicked off, but it became apparent over the first several days that the Iraqi Air Force wasn't going to be participating in that way in the conflict, and we rolled from that defensive counter-air, think air-to-air defence goalkeepers into a land strike role. In 2003, we didn't have the amazing and robust refuelling capability in our Air Force that we have today. We were struggling along with our ageing 707 tankers, which didn't have, we didn't have the same number of aircraft, and we didn't have the same serviceability that we enjoy today with our KC-30 aircraft. And so as a result, when I went through my operational conversion on the Hornet, I had a single mission where I managed to have a couple of plugs, a couple of very unsuccessful ones as well, and that was the sum total of my air-to-air refueling experience. So in the lead up to the kickoff of the combat operation component of that deployment, we were actually about 3 or 4 weeks in the Middle East prepared, in that, if you remember that build up as everything built up for the decision to either proceed or not proceed, and George Bush and everyone was shaping and looking to see whether or not there'd be a back down from the Iraqi forces. As that was occurring, myself and my counterpart, who came to the squadron at the same time from Hornet training, were qualifying on air-to-air refueling in the skies over our host nation and in the northern Arabian Gulf, so that we would actually be qualified to do the air-to-air refueling that was required and more confident in it. Each time you go up to that air-to-air refueling aircraft, you're quite invested in the outcome, because one of kind of 3 things is going to happen. You're either going to take on your fuel and carry on the way that you hope. You may be unable to do that due to an aircraft unserviceability on both either the tanker or the fighter that you're flying, or in the worst case you have some sort of mishap with it where you're unable to take on the fuel you need and you break part of your aircraft or something, in which case you're diverting. So we end up in a situation where at all times we're showing up behind that tanker with enough fuel to go somewhere else. It just might not be where you intend to go in the first place. An 8.5 hour sortie in a fighter is interesting, because in those types of things it actually tends to be quite long periods of low mental activity, and punctuated by points of interest, I suppose, things like air-to-air refueling or things that happen in the conflict. But when you're on call waiting to be required, there's certainly periods that are more downtime than other periods during that time. The hardest part about 8.5 hours in a fighter, in my view, is actually being strapped to a metal seat. We're not able to stand up, walk around. We're having to eat and drink and remain hydrated in case something goes wrong and you find yourself on the ground in the desert. You need to be stepping off in the best possible physical state. So you need to be fed, watered. That also means you need to be able to relieve yourself and do all those other things over an extended period while flying a single-seat aircraft and getting air-to-air refueling, and in some cases conducting land strikes in support of the friendly forces on the ground. So being strapped to that metal seat was probably the hardest thing, and particularly over in those first few missions, the longer missions that we did in that particular operation in 2003. You would stand up from that seat at the end of a mission and just in quite a degree of pain just from sitting on that seat for that length of time. And then when you got back in 2 days later for that next mission and you sat down, it was like you'd never had the opportunity to stand up, and that over time became probably one of the things that we we had to deal with the most. Fortunately, by the time 2016 rolled around and our squadron was in that operation, we'd had some other different types of cushions and all sorts of other things that were able to be used at different times to make that a little bit easier. But you know, you can't really help physics ultimately, and there's only so much you can do. The 2003 deployment was part of the limited coalition that was involved in that campaign. So we were based on a US Air Force base within a host nation base for that deployment, but working alongside both US forces and British forces on that base and in that operation. In 2016, for Operation Okra, we were also again on a host nation base within a US Air Force enclave, and then conducting operations in a much broader coalition environment up in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Syria, in support of the government of Iraq. In 2003, I deployed as part of No. 75 Squadron. I was a 75 Squadron pilot at the time. At the completion of that operation, we came back to Australia and resumed our peacetime role at 75 Squadron at RAAF Base Tyndall, just outside Katherine in the Northern Territory. After that, my career took me to Canberra to a staff job, and then from there on to No. 3 Squadron, and then to an exchange period flying Hornets and Super Hornets with the US Navy in California. I was CO of 3 Squadron from 2015 to 2017, which included a period where our squadron provided the fighter element in support of Operation Okra in the Middle East. That operation for 3 Squadron spanned about 6 or 7 months of responsibility to provide that fighter element. We had some members from other squadrons supplement us, but the crux of the deployment for that period was made up of No. 3 Squadron members across 2 separate deployments, essentially back to back, where we had, to all intents and purposes, split the squadron in half and went out in 2 parts. Those sorties were quite similar to the ones in 2003, with a couple of main exceptions. First was it was a different host nation base and it was a little bit further away, and the missions tended to be longer. Secondly, our aircraft, our Hornet aircraft, between 2003 and the time that I was flying them on that deployment, were upgraded significantly, and so we were blessed to have better software and avionics and sensors and data links and those sorts of things, which gave us a better situational awareness of what was happening both on the ground and in the air. And then also, I think our fighter force had been in that operation since the late part of 2014 with the Super Hornets and then the other classic Hornet squadrons. And so we came into, when 3 Squadron went into that operation, we came into a relatively well understood, functioning and kind of bedded down process that was very good, I think, at the limited application of lethal force when we needed to, in support of our friendly ground forces and the government of Iraq and the mission that we had at that time. I think the biggest point of difference between 03 to 16 was in 2003 we went into a situation where we were kind of cobbled in very rapidly to support a very rapidly building up US and coalition military presence in the Middle East, and there was a lot of evolving and developing and things like that that were happening at that time. By comparison, by 2016 when we were there, we were in a relatively established situation. The coalition environment was well known. Australia's participation in it was well articulated and wasn't really subject to the same degree of change. There was also a lot more certainty about the nature of the opposition we would face, the limited nature of the conflict, and the type of unlawful armed groups that we were sent there to provide protection against, compared to I think a less well defined, certainly in my mind at the front edge of it in 2003, type of scenario we were going in, the sort of fight that we were expecting and the adversary we were likely to face. I think the standout memory from 2016 was just an overwhelming sense of pride in the way that the squadron functioned together. We go on exercises quite regularly in the fighter force with our international partners. We host them in Australia in some large international exercises such as Pitch Black and Talisman Sabre, and so we get to see the way that we operate and our teams operate with and in comparison with our partners and allies around the world quite regularly. I'm always monumentally impressed with the quality of human beings that the Royal Australian Air Force brings to the fight, both on exercise and in operations. And it was the greatest privilege of my career to date has been leading the women and men of Number 3 Squadron over a period of 3 years, including that 6 or 7 months that we had members of our team conducting those operations in the Middle East in trying conditions, in hotter heat than we would experience ordinarily in Australia, and under pressure to be providing those response options to government to protect friendly forces on the ground. And so with a far greater emphasis on mission success in getting our aircraft airborne in more trying conditions with fatigue and heat and all the rest of it. The way those women and men of our Air Force work with our coalition partners to do what we do, I think is breathtaking. And the approach and the attitude that our people take to innovate and to crack on and get the job done while preserving all the things that we hold dear, including and most importantly the safety of our people, I think is fundamentally what sets Australian service people apart from our coalition partners in a lot of cases. We're in this situation where just part of a long stream, a long thread of Australian women and men who stand up to do what needs to be done, and ultimately that's the nature of service, isn't it? So for me, yeah, I'm a very active participant in Anzac Day. I'm the proud dad of 3 young girls, and we go to the dawn service, and we do that out of memory of the people that both haven't come home, the people that have but have come home altered physically or mentally, and also the people that even as we're standing there on a cold Canberra morning or a cold Newcastle morning at Nobby's Beach or wherever we happen to be, while we are doing that, are standing the watch somewhere else around the world, on the sea or on the land or in the air. Fundamentally, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I think there's a tendency to misappropriate terms like heroism and service in our community, but I think the fundamental highest quality of service is doing it willingly, doing it quietly, and doing it without a need or an expectation of recognition. And ultimately there have been tens of thousands of people that have done that in peacetime and in war over the many years, and the fact that myself and almost my generation of Australian servicemen have seen a higher degree of active operational service than those in the decades prior to us, it doesn't take away from the service of the men and women that served at, for example, Mirage deployments to places like Butterworth in similarly arduous conditions and a long way from home, but in times of peace. And we've been fortunate in Australia to enjoy such long periods of peace. So in terms of how would I like my service remembered, I think the answer to that is in a manner consistent with the service of the other hundreds of thousands of Australian women and men who have put on the uniform and done their job without need for recognition.